Hi, this is Dave Douglas, and that's the music of Kalia Vandever, trombonist, composer, has a great, beautiful new solo record. It's called We Fell in Turn. You can hear Kalia all over town, all over the world, really, playing trombone beautifully. Lots of improvising groups. She's in Mary Halverson's current group. We talk about music. We do a segment for the extra. We listen to some of her earlier record, Regrowth. And thanks for listening. Greenleafmusic.com is where you'll find all these episodes, as well as the entire catalog. We really hope that you will come and subscribe and support the work that we do. And here we go with the music of Kalia Vandever. Kalia Vandever, thank you so much for making time to join me. I know how busy you are. You're playing in about 1 million projects and on the road, and this new solo recording just came out. So lots to talk about. I like to start out asking about composition, about the conception, because you have such a really beautiful and unique approach to ensemble writing. Ensemble playing, you tend to use, it seems to me, you correct me if I'm wrong, but interlocking voices and a sort of very participatory sense of how each person in an ensemble is an important member. Is that an important part of the way you think about the music you wrote, for example, on this record?
Well, this is a different approach because of the nature of solo work. I don't really have anyone else in mind when preparing for recording. So much of the ensemble work, I have the other voices in mind, and I'm thinking about form and improvisation in a group setting, and I'm thinking about the other instruments in the band and how that fits in with my voice. Mm-hmm. But with the solo work, I'm only interacting with myself. And that's the beauty of this project, and that's the beauty of going into it having somewhat of an idea of what I wanted to record, but so much of what ended up being released were improvisations. So
the solo recording also sounds really conversational, like dialogue, even though it's only you playing.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so fun about the solo work, especially with pedals. I get to interact with myself, and no one knows my sound better than me. And I'm very melody driven, so I often think about a strong statement to start with and how the melody unfolds from there. So the progression is very natural when I'm playing in that setting versus a group setting.
But it sounds like what you just said made me think of the piece that we just heard from Regrowth, your previous record, which I think it's a quintet, right? With Emmanuel Wilkins and Nick Dunstan and some other players, and that piece that you heard called Soft, there's a very interactive and self-reflexive sense to it. The way that it rolls along, the way that you and Emmanuel play on the form. It's really that same sense of let this unravel, I think is the word you used.
Absolutely. And when I wrote that piece, it started as, again, a solo improvisation that I recorded.
Wow.
Yeah, and originally I was treating it more like an etude. Like I wrote it out. I'm like, oh, this sounds like a nice etude. And then I tried it in a duo setting with Manuel. We had one duo gig during the pandemic, and that was the first time it was performed. And then I brought it to the quartet. So I played the melody by myself. And now when we have quartet gigs, I'm mostly just carrying the melody by myself. But I knew that I wanted to have Emmanuel on the record on a few pieces. So it's nice to be able to pass the melody between the two of us.
It works really, really well. It's also the timbre of your two instruments blends well. I guess you've known him for a while now. So
yeah, we went to Juilliard together and we've played together quite a bit. So I knew that I wanted to have him involved.
That's great. So let me get this. Wow, that's really interesting because when I heard the song, I felt like you must have sat down and worked out all the parts. And then to hear that it was just a solo trombone conception, I'd have to go back and listen again and see how you would come to that. So is that the process for a lot of your work, would you say?
I would say it's normally me at home, either recording something on my horn or recording something on guitar or piano. I've gotten in the habit of recording myself improvising at home because that's often where the best ideas come from. So I would say not all of the pieces for the quartet or quintet come from trombone improvisations, but they definitely come from me just sitting at home alone, like tinkering on an instrument.
Wow. And has it always been that way for you? That's always been the way that you...
I would say so. It wasn't until I recognized that the process came from improvisation. I didn't think of it like that before. But it kind of relieved some stress for me when I go into a space to write. And it's like, instead of considering it always as composing, which there are times where I like sit down, I'm like, okay, I'm going to like really flesh out this idea. But it helps me if I'm going into something improvising because there's less pressure on myself to like always finish a session with something at the end.
So you don't think about it as composition as you're doing it? Not
always. No, unless, when I'm commissioned to write for other people.
Yeah.
That feels
that feels on.
Like that feels like I'm sitting down and composing a work. But the way that my brain works and the way that like I just put pressure on myself, it helps me going into writing for myself if I'm treating it like improvisation initially.
That's so cool. Were you doing that before you got to Juilliard, for example?
No, definitely not. No, I only started composing my senior year of high school.
Where were you?
I went to LA County High School for the Arts. And I was studying with Walter Smith III, so he helped me flesh out some of my earliest songs.
Oh, that's so great.
Really sweet, yeah.
And then would you say that's what propelled you to apply and get in and go to Juilliard?
I knew that I wanted to go to music school, so I had applied to 4 or 5 different conservatories. And I would say going to an arts high school certainly encouraged me to pursue a career in music. But originally I wanted to go to NEC. So I got in there and then I found out about Juilliard and I got in on a full ride. And I wanted to be in New York City, so that's when I accepted that offer.
Amazing. That's great. Did you go, so your full high school experience was at LA School of the Arts?
Yes.
And that's where you're from originally?
I'm from Los Angeles originally, yeah.
So you must have, I guess you must have known Walter Smith III for a long time.
Yeah, he taught at my school all 4 years I was there, and he played in town often. So I would go see him at the Blue Whale, and that's when I was introduced to Ambrose's music as well. And so I feel like a lot of like my music taste in modern jazz, I suppose, was because of that school and that environment.
Wow, that's really great. That's really interesting. So now you've been in New York for how many years?
This is my 10th year.
So Juilliard plus.
Yes, yeah.
And you have not looked back. A lot of people come here from LA and then they encounter the weather and the living conditions and they go, yeah, I'm going back.
I have not looked back, and I just spent a week in LA. I got back a couple days ago. And normally what happens is I arrive in LA, and the first couple days I'm really nostalgic and considering whether I would move back. And then towards the end of the week, I'm like, okay, now I miss New York and I want to go back. And that certainly happened this trip.
Wow. Yeah, there's something about the energy in New York it's hard to match.
Yeah, and my community is here, and because of how much I tour, like this is my home base. And when I'm back in New York, I want to see my friends and be able to see any type of show. And I feel like that's only possible in New York.
That's great. You're based in Brooklyn now? Then?
Yeah. I'm in Brooklyn.
That's great. Awesome. So before we get into the solo stuff, I wanted to play one more track from Regrowth, the previous album. This one's called An Unwelcome Visit. And shall I just play it, or do you want to say anything about it? Is it hopefully not autobiographical?
No, the story is funny in that I was writing the melody, and at the time I had a hard time titling pieces. I don't feel that way anymore. But with that one specifically, I was writing and I heard two cats fighting outside of my window. And so I looked out, and one was just like kind of staking their territory. And so then I was like, an unwelcome visit. That's when it came to mind, and that's what ended up being the name of that piece, just because of what was happening at the time.
Wow. Okay, let's hear some. beautiful piece. Great band. I'm struck listening to your new one, but also to this one, and having heard you on some other people's projects, your use of space is kind of noticeable and remarkable. You think about that at all? Like leaving?
I think about space a lot, especially with the solo work. I feel like a lot can be said in the moments of silence, whether it's actual silence or there's little happening. It also makes phrases or melodies more impactful. And when I'm playing with other people, it also allows space for the other musicians to speak. So it's certainly something that is a part of my sound.
I wonder, because I think for a lot of people sitting down to write, there's this feeling like, oh, okay, I'm writing now, so I have to fill up all the space. Well, it sounds like your writing process is quite a bit different in that a lot of it comes out of improvisation and finding things organically by playing them and then transcribing those ideas and turning them into your compositions. Mm-hmm. Would you say that's why, like that process is why the use of space is so present in your writing?
I suppose, yeah. I mean, it seems so connected to me, improvisation and composition. And when I'm playing with a band or in a solo setting, I'm rarely thinking about how I can compose, a melody right now that sounds like really true to me, but it's more so like what is happening in the music, what is inspiring me, where am I being led? Those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, both in improvisation and composition. Like where are my ears going when composing or when improvising? And I feel like I'm pretty intuitive in that way, musically and compositionally. So that's how I'm thinking about it most of the time.
Do you feel like that's a different practice than the one you must have learned intensively at, for example, Juilliard, but a lot of jazz education situations, we're looking at, the 1950s, 1960s way that music coming out of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Bill Evans and, this tradition that we're fortunate enough to have. But do you feel like you've had to make a conscious decision to think differently in making your own music?
I wouldn't say recently I've made a conscious decision to approach composition differently. Maybe when I was at Juilliard, it felt like I had to make a choice whether to follow in what I was being taught or stray away from it. And that was certainly difficult at the time, given that I was in an institutional environment. But I'm very fortunate that in the last, I don't know, however many years, 5 or 6 years since I've been out of school, where like I don't feel like what I'm doing is being questioned because I am a part of a really supportive environment. And all the musicians.
You're your own boss now. Welcome.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's great. Yeah. And I get to choose the people I play with and surround myself with, both professionally and personally. So yeah, I feel like the ways in which I'm pushing the music is supported and encouraged now, which is really nice.
That's really interesting. And I have to ask, I mean, I hadn't really thought about this, but you still do play with some of the musicians that you met at Juilliard. Do you feel like there's any sort of special kinship that you have because of the things that you experienced at Juilliard? And this could be this doesn't necessarily reflect on Juilliard, but more the fact that you came through this program, this institution, where certain things were being taught and expected, and that you had to find your own way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that creates bonds for you with somebody like Emmanuel, for example?
Oh, absolutely. We were doing a talk at NYU together about a month ago because Emmanuel teaches a course there. So he invited me, and we started the talk by addressing the fact that we both were these, I don't know how you want to call it, but we were rebelling in a way when we were at Juilliard.
I thought you were going to say refugees.
No, no. We were rebellious, and we started touring towards the end of school, which was really difficult to manage when in the program, and how we both like emerged, and lead our own projects. And obviously Manuel is killing it. And
well, you are too.
Yeah, and I'm quite busy with my own stuff as well. And so it's nice to kind of consider our trajectory and where we started in our friendship. But we were in a couple ensembles together, like my last 2 years, and he certainly knew how difficult it was for me being there. And so I feel like having his support then, I was confident that we would remain friends after school. So I still play with him, and then I play with Micah Thomas as well. He's a great pianist, and we didn't talk so much about the program while we were there, but there was this like unspoken agreement that like at some point we're going to do our own thing musically.
Interesting. Yeah. I know quite a few people that have come through, and I don't want to put it on Juilliard in particular, but, come through pretty intense music education experiences and just sort of learned what they learned and then ended up doing their own thing. And it's what you're bringing to the music is really unique and coming out of a strong connection to the whole history of music. And that's great to hear. So just to pivot, then what made you decide to do a solo project? That's the record that's coming out right now, basically.
Right. So I've always been intrigued by solo performance. And I had never seen a trombonist perform solo before, especially not with pedals. And about 3 years ago, it's 2023. So yeah, I think also 4 years ago in 2019.
Pandemic kind of changed things, didn't it?
Yeah. I played my first solo show, and I was terrified, but it felt challenging in a way that I wasn't used to. And I think I've always been driven by challenge in life and music. So I played my first show, and it was really unsettling, but also really freeing in a way. And so much of what I think about when I play and think about the trombone is timbre and vibration and sound. And it was nice to be able to interact with that in real time. And so I played a couple more solo shows before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, when live stream performances were coming up, I would, of course, do solo shows because that's all I could do.
Wow.
And I knew that at some point I wanted to record, but I didn't have plans to. And then the label manager at AKP heard one of my live streams and reached out to me. And that's how it started.
Wow, that's great. And that's an LA-based label that approached you.
Yes, AKP Records out in LA.
That's so great. Let's just hear a little bit of I think this is the first track. It's called Temper the Wound. Beautiful. Just so we get a basic sense, what sorts of electronics are you how are you altering your sound? Like, what are you using? I know that's a nerdy question.
That's all right. So for the record specifically, we used at least 8 different pedals. We had access to that many pedals. So the producer, Lee Medvin, brought a bunch of toys to play with, and then I brought my usual setup, which is pretty limited in
Which is what?
that it's.
What are you using in your
So I
setup?
use the Memory Man
Uh-huh.
delay pedal, which also has a looper function, and then I did a looper. Then I have a harmonizer, and then a pedal that I recently introduced into my setup is Holograms Microcosm, and that one's been really fun to play with. But that's my setup. I have currently 5 pedals, and that's all I work with.
Yeah, it was really interesting to read what you wrote about how this particular project gave you a feeling of tying into some of your ancestral heritage in Hawaii and some of the spirit, the spiritual. I don't want to say myths. I'm searching for words. Why don't you help me?
Sure.
Tell me
So
how it did tie in for you.
yeah, a couple of the elements that I was thinking about when recording was lineage and my Hawaiian culture and the family that currently lives there, and my grandparents who are from there. I have recently been diving into some writings of my grandfather's, who was born in the Philippines but immigrated to Hawaii in his early years, and thinking about lineage in the sense of like where did they begin? Where did my grandma and grandpa begin, and where did their stories begin? How did they end up in Hawaii, and how did my mom, end up in California, and how can I feel connected to them? Now that my grandpa has passed, and I found that I feel most connected to him when I'm playing music.
Wow.
And I've felt him in rooms that I've performed in. And he often will visit me in my dreams. So that's another thing that I'm playing with this album is like what comes up in dreams. And for me, that's been this connection with my ancestors. And so much of some of these spiritual elements are very, very inherent in Hawaiian culture. There are these spiritual guides that I reference, which are called Amakua, and it can be in an animal or it can be in a body of water, but it's like your ancestors live in those beings or those elements, and that's very common in Hawaiian mythology.
Wow. So, right. It sounds to me like these forces are just there in your life naturally, and you've now, connected them to this specific music project. So it's maybe you could say a new reason for making the music is to connect to those spirits.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not something that I went into the weekend of recording thinking about, but because so much of it was improvised, and there were certain things that Lee and I were coming up with that weekend, that ended up being some the themes that came up for me.
Wow. Well, it's really a beautiful sounding piece of work, and when I read that, I mean, I hadn't thought about it, of course, and so when I read that, it made a lot of sense for me. But it also feels like a bit of a change in your music. Like, do you think going forward, if you'll be writing for bands again, that the experience of having done this way and connected with ancestors in this way is going to be something that you permanently add to your language?
I think it was already a part of my language before, even when playing with
Wow.
my band.
Yeah.
There's one song that I wrote for the quartet called More of the Good Stuff Later that I wrote as my grandfather was dying. And I was performing it a lot during that period, and so much came up for me during that period.
Wow.
And now
Yeah.
when I play it, I certainly feel his presence. So, I mean, I certainly intend on always writing music for a band. And I feel like this process and this album lives as something independent from my ensemble work. But it's definitely different approaches, but it's all part of my
Interesting.
being. So I'm sure in some ways it'll affect future albums.
Let's hear another piece, Mirrored Solitude. It's just gorgeous. Mirrored Solitude. You're also a really good writer of prose, at least what I've read, and perhaps of poetry too. Do you see a link between expressing yourself in words and expressing yourself in music?
Absolutely. I've been thinking about poetry a lot more and including that in my live performance, which is a new element. And that's come from playing with this collective of mine called Tilt. We play this piece of mine called Fall Again, in which I wrote a poem and that's read over the piece. And going into this solo release show, I was thinking a lot about some of the writings that I mentioned earlier of my grandfather's and like how to include his story in a more explicit way. So I wrote a new poem that I'll read during the set, which is nice, and that's been really fun to play with because there's so much power in that, and because I feel like the solo work is powerful, it's like nice to give someone an actual story to follow, when listening to the music.
Yeah, I've been hearing about Tilt. It's a collective. Can you mention the other members?
Yeah, so it's myself on trombone and voice, Isabel Crespo Pardo on voice, and Carmen Rothwell on bass and voice.
That's great. And will you guys make a record at any point coming up?
Yes, we have recorded a record.
Oh, great.
And it'll come out in 2024.
Awesome.
We don't have a date yet, but we're releasing with the label Dear Life Records.
I heard you also wrote some music for the Westerlies, good friends of mine.
Yes, yeah. I've
So,
written two pieces for them, but
uh-huh,
the first one, called "Calling Me Back Home," they premiered at Westerly's Fest a couple years ago.
great. I would love to hear. Will they put that out, do you think? Or are you going to
Maybe
record
one
it
day.
yourself?
We don't have a plan yet, but I would be open to either.
I made a record with them. I just was like, no, 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 no. I'm writing the music. You guys are going to play.
Hmm. Yeah, I love the Westerlies, so if they
Yeah.
wanted to record it, I would
Oh,
love for it to exist in that format.
okay. Any of you listening, you heard it here first. I know you have a lot of new projects going on, but I wanted to ask you, um, because some of your writing has been so specific about your experiences in the music. I guess the question I have is, do you feel like change is coming? Do you feel like things are getting better in terms of equality and inclusion and the scene being more welcoming of all kinds of people? And by the
Mm,
scene, I mean music generally, but also jazz, improvised music.
mm. I'll speak to jazz specifically because I feel like the issue has been way more prevalent in jazz than any other scene, especially now that I'm a part of many music scenes in New York and abroad.
Yeah.
I've noticed glaring issues still in the jazz scene.
Uh-huh.
And it's
Uh-huh.
getting better, but the culture is still behind other scenes. Um, and it's hard to see, but I feel like there's a balance given my community. And I do feel that my generation of musicians are incredibly supportive and way more inclusive than maybe certain positions I've been in with like older musicians in
Mm-hmm.
the scene. And when I was in school, mainly
Mm-hmm.
being taught by older men. Now that I've been out of school, it's been a lot better and a lot safer of a space.
I feel that with the new generation of players too. A big change.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Long way
I'm
to
very
go.
thankful. Long way to go, but I'm thankful that our generation is changing things.
Yeah, in so many ways, in so many
Hmm.
essential, crucial ways.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a different if it's a different sensibility, even than the generation immediately before. So I'm glad to hear you say that because it's not easy.
Hmm.
It's difficult, and it's interesting to hear you say that speaking to whatever we want to call the jazz community, as opposed to the other communities that you're mentioning worldwide that you're involved with. I find that surprising because I often find like I can identify the problems in my travels too, being involved in
Right.
different curational projects, different kinds of presentations and platforming of music, and I just feel like we need to all be pulling together and creating as many opportunities for as many different kinds of people as we can. And it's
Hmm.
sort of the way we move forward. And so it's great to hear you say that your cohort, if I can use that word, is
Hmm.
is maybe more progressive in that regard.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's nice. I feel like there are more opportunities for younger folks to be in positions like you mentioned, curatorial positions.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like they're including more younger folks who are in the scene in the like decision making process, which I think is really important too, especially if most of the people who are up for a grant, let's say, or up for like a position at at a venue, like if they're being chosen to play at a venue, it's like there should also be like a younger voice when deciding those things, and I feel like that's happening a little more too, which is important.
It's great. Um, so people listening to this might have missed your record release solo show at National Sawdust, but where else? Where else will you be? I mean, like any big projects coming up in the coming months that we should look out for?
I'm playing with Mary Halverson.
Right. You guys are on the
Yeah.
road, right? New England.
Yeah. Um, and then I'll be touring in Europe with Joy Guidry this summer. We're playing Alarm Festival in Cologne, Jazz Festival, and I'll also be playing with Nick Dunstan in Cologne as well. He has a project called Spider Season that I'm a part of.
Yeah.
And Nick is planning more for the fall as well.
When is that concert in Cologne with Nick?
August. It's in August.
Oh,
let me
because
see.
I'm playing in Cologne with Nick also in August. He's playing with my quintet. I think it's around the 18th or something in Cologne.
Yeah, it's before that we're playing.
Hope I get to hear you all.
Yeah. I don't know the specific date, but we're playing in, I think, the second week of August.
Kalia has a very good website. So if you're curious,
I keep it
go
up to
check
date.
it out.
I try to.
It's up to date. And you can see where she's playing and get the new records and all of that. Thank you so much, Kalia. It's great talking to you. It's great hearing the music. I really appreciate it. You've told me that you've picked a track that we can talk about in our podcast extra, and yet you haven't told me what it is yet. So I can't tell the listeners what it is, but for all you subscribers, there's going to be something cool. Thank you.
Thank you
Great
so much.
talking to you. Wonderful. Once again, that's the music of Kalia Vandever, great trombonist. It was so nice talking to her. I hope you go see some of her shows and come visit us at greenleafmusic.com. Thanks for listening.